Welcome and thank you for joining the Western Energy Imbalance Market Regional Issues Forum. Before we begin, please ensure you've opened the WebEx participant and chat panels by using the associated icons located at the bottom of your screen. Please note that all audio connections are muted at this time. To ask a question, press pound 2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point please state your name and question. Should you require technical assistance, send a chat to the event producer. With that, I'm going to turn the conference over to Pam Sporberg, RIF Chair. Please go ahead.
Hello and welcome to our third virtual EIM Regional Issues Forum. I think we have a great agenda for you guys today. We'll get to that right after we do our call for quorum. So for quorum, if the liaisons could please press pound 2 on your keypad in order to flag for being unmuted. And I can start with that quorum. I am Pam Sporborg with Portland General Electric, and I am the Transmission Owning Utility Liaison and the RIF Chair.
Okay, Matt LaCar, Pacific Gas and Electric, with the Transmission Owner Sector and the RIF Acting Vice Chair.
Reese Hampton with the Neighboring Balancing Authority Area Sector. Pam, did you hear me? Reese Hampton, Public Generating Pool.
Okay, I heard Therese Hampton with the Public Generating Pool. And did I hear Cameron Yurkowski as well? So, I think that was Clay MacArthur?
Hi, Pam. This is Clay MacArthur with Deseret Power, representing the publicly owned utility sector.
Excellent. And just as a note to press pound 2 on your keypad to flag yourself for the operator.
Hey, Pam, it's Tony. I thought I had chimed in already, but just in case I hadn't, because I just got the operator prompt, this is Tony Barnett, publicly owned utility.
Thank you, Tony. Cameron, I know you're on. Have we heard from you?
Hi, Pam. This is Cameron. Can you hear me now?
I can hear you now. Thank you. And Cheryl, I know you're on as well. Are you available to press pound 2?
Yes, I was just unmuted by the operator. This is Cheryl Murray with the Office of Consumer Services for the Consumer Advocate Group. And today I'm also serving as Jennifer Gardner's proxy for the Public Interest Groups.
Thank you, Cheryl. Aaron, are you available?
Pam, did you get me before? This is Cheryl Murray.
Cheryl, I do have you. You were unmuted successfully.
Hey, Pam. This is Erin Kester with Avangrid Renewables.
Excellent. Thank you, Erin. We've got you. Suzanne Cooper, are you available to press pound 2?
Pam, this is Suzanne Cooper. Can you hear me?
Yes. Hi, Suzanne.
Hi.
Okay, so is there anyone we're missing? I believe that is a quorum for the sector liaison. And before we get to our panelists today, we have an announcement for an updated schedule on the Governance Review Committee from Therese Hampton.
Thank you, Pam. The Governance Review Committee was scheduled to have a meeting today. Actually, some may have noticed. We have canceled that meeting, and we'll be providing a schedule update here, and then also tomorrow at the EIM Governing Body meeting. The Governance Review Committee is making great progress and actually has a goal, has been working on a straw proposal that would be shared for public comment. If folks have noticed, this meeting was canceled today, and we have a number of executive sessions planned for July, which is intended to be kind of putting the final touches on a straw proposal that the goal is to release the end of July for public comment. So that's really, there isn't a public session of the GRC yet scheduled, but we will certainly schedule one once the straw proposal is released.
Thank you, Therese. I appreciate the update. With that, we will turn it over to our panel today. Our first panel will be on virtual bidding, and we'll feature Carrie Bentley from the Western Power Trading Forum to give us an overview of what is virtual bidding. We'll also hear from Polo Soto from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to bring us a regulator's perspective on virtual bidding, and from Jeff Nelson from the Southern California Edison, who will present from a load-serving entity perspective within California. I think we have an excellent panel here today, and I hope there are plenty of questions, but we will go through each panelist's presentation first before taking questions at the end. And with that, I will turn it over to Carrie to kick us off with our panel.
Good morning, Pam. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, and if you could turn your video on if you're able as a speaker, that would be excellent.
I think it should be on. Can you see me?
I do see
and then,
you. Thank you, Karen.
Great. And then I have a presentation. Can you pull that up too?
I see the presentation on my screen. I think Nikki is running those for us.
Oh, weird. I don't see it on. Oh, okay. Now I see it on mine. Okay, great. Good morning, everyone. Like Pam said, I'm Carrie Bentley. I'm the CEO of Gridwell Consulting, and along with Callie Wells, we run the California ISO Committee for the Western Power Trading Forum. So the WPTF is a nonprofit trade forum, and its mission is to better enable competitive markets and transparency across the West and Mexico. The CAISO committee, as it sounds like, it deals with everything California ISO. So Pam reached out and asked if I could give a little history. You can go to the next slide, please. Give a little history on virtuals. She said to keep it at a 101 level with maybe some 201 and 301 commentary. So I'll really keep it pretty basic. There'll be some oversimplification, but for the most part, virtuals are a straightforward part of a market. So I'll do an overview of what virtual supply and demand even is, and then talk about how it's fitting and cleared in the market, and then talk a little bit more specifically about virtuals in the California ISO markets, and then get into key takeaways, and in particular, takeaways for expanding the markets to the West, really why virtuals are a component of our market. So if you go to the next slide, this is slide 3. So it's part, I say standard market design in quotes because there is no FERC standard market design, but when independent system operators and RTOs first kick off, FERC expects to see virtual bidding as part of it. It was initially implemented in the California ISO in February of 2011, so it's been a long-standing part of the market. However, there are only virtuals internally, and they were suspended on the intertie, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. Just so there's no confusion, the rest of the world refers to it as virtuals, but the CAISO calls it convergence bidding. So if you look at any of the materials at the CAISO, it'll be under convergence bidding, and then it's called virtual supply and demand, but the overall topic is convergence bidding. So at a very high level, what virtuals are, is financial positions taken in the day-ahead market and liquidated in the real-time market at that same node. It shouldn't be confused with congestion revenue rights, or CRRs. which is financial positions taken in the day-ahead market between two nodes. So you're not trying to establish a hedge between two nodes with virtual, but really you're trying to take a position between the day-ahead market and the real-time market. And if you go to the next slide, please. And it's a virtual position. So if you go to slide 4. So just at the most basic level, a virtual supply offer is an offer to sell energy in the day-ahead market and buy it, and then you have to buy it back at real time, and you buy it back at that same pricing node. Virtuals can be at nodes, at trading hubs, at DLAC. All it is a financial position between the day-ahead and real-time market. So if it's virtual supply, then you get paid the day-ahead price, and then you have to pay the real-time price. And then virtual demand is the opposite. It's an offer to buy energy in the day-ahead market, so you have to pay the day-ahead price, and then you sell it back in real time, so you get paid the real-time price. And again, with both of these, it's not tied to any physical asset or actual load. You may have a physical asset or you may have physical load, but your virtual supply and your virtual position has nothing to do with these physical assets. So then another key term is net virtual supply and net virtual demand, and this is because different scheduling coordinators can take offsetting positions at the same node. So you may end up with more virtual supply than more virtual demand or vice versa. And so when you start talking about the impact on the market, when you talk about net virtual supply, that means you have more supply than demand. And that's, I think, a pretty intuitive concept. If you can actually go back one slide. Okay, so now that we just talked a little bit about what a virtual is, I want to talk about a little bit more about why it's part of FERC standard market design. So the idea of having an ISO in general is that you're going to establish reliability through a market structure. So it gets very complicated, as we all know. You have a day-ahead market, you have a real-time market, you have all these ancillary services. But then on top of that, you also have financial products. And the intent of these financial products are to do two things generally. The first thing is to allow participants to mitigate price risk, and then two, to make the market more efficient. And so if you look at virtuals within this high level, sorry, my screen keeps flickering. Hopefully it's not flickering for you guys. But if you look at virtuals within this high level construct of what a market is, really all virtuals are trying to do and why they're part of the standard market design is because they're a tool to mitigate risk. They're also a tool to make the market more efficient. And by more efficient, what that means, at least what that means to WPTF and what that means to most economists, an efficient market is one where market rules are set up where people take profitable positions for themselves and for their own companies. It actually lowers the price or makes the price more efficient. So it enables more transactions to take place. It enables load that wants to buy at a certain price to clear against supply that's willing to provide that price. And the more market tools that you have that increase these efficiencies, kind of the more efficient market, you'll end up with a more efficient market. That's the theory anyway. But obviously, the more complicated it gets, the more you have need for things like transparency and very specific rules. And that's where virtual bidding gets a little bit complicated. So now we get to why it was suspended on interties. And this is a little bit of a 201 concept, Pam, but I think it's important, and I know Jeff and our other panelists will talk about this, to understand the theory behind virtuals and then what happens in practice. So if you're just talking about the structure of virtuals, so you are allowed to take a virtual supply or virtual demand position, like I said, on any T node, trading hub, ELAP, but you can't do it on an intertie. And this is because when we first implemented virtuals in February of 2011, interties were priced at the hourly level in half. You guys are familiar with that, the hour-ahead market. Now, interties are priced at the 15-minute market level, and we all kind of are familiar with that transition, I think. But when this was part of the initial market, there were systemic differences between the hour-ahead prices and the 5-minute prices and the day-ahead prices. And if you recall, all virtual is liquidating your position between day-ahead and real-time And whenever you have systemic pricing discrepancies, you can imagine that virtual can come in and take advantage of those systemic differences. Now, typically what will happen is if you have these systemic differences, virtuals will come in and that will point to a problem, a functional problem in the market, right? Because the whole intent between the day-ahead and real-time market is you want to set them up as cleanly and as, at least from a market perspective, as similar as possible. But if you have these systemic differences, these systemic pricing differences, you could put a virtual supply position in, right? You could say, I'm going to buy at the real-time price, and I'm going to sell, or I'm going to buy at the day-ahead price, and I'm going to sell at the real-time price. And that's what was happening on specific interties and specific hours. Day after day, the real-time price was much lower than the day-ahead price. And while perhaps these virtuals were converging the specific intertie pricing, it wasn't really helping the market at all because it was a functional, technical market difference that couldn't be resolved. So unfortunately, they had to suspend bidding on the interties in November 2011. You know, the Department of Market Monitoring, I talked about this a lot more. Someone from DMF is texting right now. So the Department of Market Monitoring talks about this a lot if you go through their old annual reports, I think for 2012. But so this is an example, I think, of when you have technical systemic issues in the market, it could lead to a financial product not working as well as it should. And so it's interesting because we've now moved on from that. We now have a 15-minute price and not an hourly price, and we don't have the same issue, but we actually haven't reinstated virtuals on intertie. Honestly, I'm not quite sure why. I think it just hasn't moved up as a priority. Okay, if we can move on now to slide 5, please. Okay. Oh, slide 4. So, yeah, perfect, slide 5. Okay, so you guys are kind of familiar now what virtual supply and virtual demand is. So how do people get these products? So they're offered into the market. So you submit a virtual supply or a virtual demand offer into the CAISO's IFM. That's just a fancy way of saying the day-ahead market. Technically, the day-ahead market is made up of the IFM and RUC. So this is just being very specific and saying that virtuals are in the IFM. It's a $1 per megawatt price pair at all the eligible nodes. And this makes it sound like you'd only have one pair, but just like a normal bid, you could have a 10-part segment. And there are no commitment costs for virtual supply offers. So it's not like you're pretending to be a generator and you have startup and minimum load. It really is as if you're just bidding, you know, a $1 per megawatt price pair in every hour. They're not subject to market power mitigation, but I'm going to talk about how they're used in market power mitigation because it's a key function of virtuals. It's not, and this is where we get into being really specific. Okay, so it's not considered in the RUC process in the day-ahead market. So I'll go through that a little bit too. But again, we're just at the high-level slide here. And there's over 100 entities registered as convergence bidding entities. And that sounds like a lot, but I have a slide later that will show you the size of the market, and it's actually probably a little bit smaller than you think. So, you know, I think I'll pause here and talk a little bit about market power mitigation, only because there's a system market power mitigation initiative going on right now, and people may be interested in how virtuals are used in that local market power mitigation, and then how they're going to be used in the system one. So again, it's, you know, you have these virtual offers not tied to physical transactions in the IFM. So they are in the market power mitigation run, but so first let's talk about local. So local market power mitigation is a 3 pivotal supplier test. And what it does is it tests that the 3 pivotal suppliers, whether they're enough to relieve the local constraint. So at the local level, what really matters for market power mitigation is cleared virtual supply. You want to see how much virtual supply is within the constraint and outside the constraint, because the market power mitigation run will use this cleared virtual supply in the tests themselves. So you can imagine if you have a lot of virtual supply within the constraint, then you're less likely to fail that 3 power mitigation constraint. If you have it outside the constraint, then it works the other way. So just like building additional physical supply in a local area, virtual supply will have the same impact on the market power mitigation run. And this means that, for example, if people expect in real time for physical supply to show up in the area, you won't actually end up having market power in that area in the day-ahead market. And that's a good function of virtual, because it's saying that the liquidity is expected to be there in real time, so you don't need to unnecessarily mitigate resources in the day-ahead market, because there's going to be enough competition in that area, right? Because you're now competing against virtual, so that's lowering the price. So there's no market power there in the day ahead, and that's accurate because in real time you're expecting physical supply to show up. So then now if you're going to talk about market power mitigation for the system level, so right now they're only talking about system market power mitigation in the real time. So you can see how virtual bidding doesn't have the same impact, right? Because you're liquidating all your financial positions in the real-time market. Now, when you move system market power to the day ahead, though, which is expected to happen eventually, that's when virtual, both supply and demand, will go through those functions, and they'll act to increase liquidity. And again, if you're net virtual demand, you may increase the chances of mitigating at a system level, or if you're net virtual supply, the opposite will happen, and you're less likely to mitigate a physical resource. So you can see it kind of gets layered and more complicated pretty quickly. It would take me an hour to fully explain the market power mitigation process for both of these, but hopefully that's just a little bit into the 201, 301 level. Okay, next slide, please. Slide 6, please. Okay, perfect. Okay, so how are virtual supply and demand cleared in the market? And I've talked about this a little bit. So, you know, they treat virtual supply and demand in the exact same manner as physical supply and demand. So it's used to clear bid and supply against bid and demand. It's eligible to set prices. So if a virtual bid is the marginal price, it will set the price. It impacts the commitment and dispatch of physical resources. This has been a huge topic in the day-ahead market enhancements on whether virtuals should have an impact on the day-ahead price, whether virtuals should impact the commitment and dispatch of physical resources, because based on economics today, the market optimization may choose to clear virtual supply over a physical resource. And I think other presenters will talk about this a lot more. So I just want to touch on this concept and not really talk about my opinion. I have very strong opinions on this, as many of you know, but I just want to make sure it's clear that the main impact of a virtual is that it's a financial position offsetting a physical one. So the role of virtuals in the day-ahead market, along with some must-offer rules, but if you set resource adequacy aside, a key component of having virtuals in the day-ahead market is it makes it a financial market, not a physical one. The CAISO is not trying to set up their prices based on physical dispatch. It really is setting up prices based on a financial market. And that's a very big difference. And there's a lot of theoretical debates on whether you want a physical market or a financial one. But I want to be clear, based on the rules today, because of a few things, but a key one is virtual. It is a day-ahead financial market. Okay, next slide, please. So this is getting into a little bit how people are operating. Slide 7, please. How people are operating today, practically. So at a practical level, there's this concept called an offsetting virtual supply and demand bid. And that's where you take a position at different P nodes that exactly offset each other. So for example, at P node A, you take a 100 megawatt virtual supply position, and at P node B, you take a 100 megawatt virtual demand position. And you do this to either hedge congestion costs or earn revenues but they also, because they offset each other exactly, now you're not exposed to certain uplift settlement charges. So it's a way to hedge these costs without getting allocated a certain amount of uplift costs. And I talk a little bit about uplift, but then I think Jack is going to talk a lot more about this. But so I talk about this offsetting virtual supply and demand bids because almost 50% of all cleared bids in the CAISO market are offsetting virtual positions. And this amount goes up and down a lot, but certainly in the last couple of years, over half are these offsetting positions, and that's what's cleared. So you can see that this is a key, a key component of how people are functionally using these virtuals. And I'll let Jack talk about the exposure uplift cost and whether that's fair or not. Okay, next slide, please. Okay, so just generally, why would someone take a virtual position? I think it's pretty intuitive for most people that if you're bidding, from a market perspective, you're trying to converge the day-ahead and real-time price. So the reason why ISOs like virtuals is because it's supposed to make what adds liquidity, and then hopefully it converges the day-ahead and real-time price, which makes things more efficient. But why would individual entities want to do this? It's typically because they want to hedge against real-time price spikes or depression. This is true for both load and gen. So you could have physical participants take these financial positions to hedge their own physical assets or physical obligations. Practically speaking, I think gen does this a lot more than load, at least large IOU load, but sometimes it's the smaller participants that need these financial tools more. If you're a large organization, often you could self-hedge through your own positions. If you're a small organization, that's where you really need these financial tools. You're also less able to take on risk. As a small organization, the price spikes hit you more because your balance sheet can't absorb those as easily. I want to emphasize that sometimes that these tools, if you're a large organization, they're not as helpful to you, even though you would think they would be some of the more major players. And I think that's more true for the physical assets. When you get into the financial or marketers, they may be using this to hedge against other financial positions they have. And that's very typical. They also may just want to earn revenues within a single financial product. Or it's not on here, but another one is they may take positions in order to resell those positions to other people. A lot of times, the smaller general load may not want to interact directly with the CAISO market. They may not be set up to be a convergence bidder or even CRR is a good example for this too. But they can go to a financial participant who has a position and they can ask to take a position with that financial entity. So even though when you look at the participants in virtuals, you'll see that a significant portion are from financials or marketers. That doesn't mean that ultimately they're not reselling this to someone with a physical asset or that physical assets aren't getting involved with these financial entities. That position, that participation is just who is engaging directly with the CAISO, not ultimately who is the holder of that virtual risk or virtual position. Okay, last slide, please. Oh no, it's not the last slide, sorry. Okay, so I just want to get into the market benefits, and then I'll wrap it up with my 3 last slides. So historically, this has been a FERC requirement, and so if we go to EDAM and extend the day-ahead market, I'm not sure that FERC would simply waive it. Things have changed since 2011, so who knows, but just generally, it has been part of FERC's standard market design. As I noted, it improves market liquidity and it increases the competitiveness of the market because you have more buyers and sellers competing against each other. This is especially true for certain nodes. If you look at the entire market, you may think we have 55,000, 60,000 megawatts of supply and demand competing for each other. But when you look at the nodal level where these virtual transactions are occurring, really that's where you see the benefits of market liquidity. So when you get to the 301 level and you start looking at, is this making the market more efficient? It's really hard to look at these averages, right? The average participation, the average hourly participation, because it really drives down to the nodal level and what's happening at the individual nodes and trading hubs. Like I said, it improves the ability for market participants to hedge various risks. And the thing that WPTF likes is that when profitable, it lowers the overall cost and leads to a more efficient day-ahead market. And so that, I think, again, the key of financial products and ISO is that if people act in their own self-interest, does it make the market better? And to me, that's a key test on whether a financial product is necessary or not. And again, theoretically, it should converge the prices between the day-ahead and real-time market. Did I talk about this anywhere else? I don't think I talked about this anywhere else, so I'll say it right now. Practically, what's happening right now is wind is not bidding into the day-ahead market, and virtual supply is coming in. And if we go to the next slide, please. I want to show you this. Okay, so the 2019 annual report for DMM hasn't come out yet. I assume because of COVID it's delayed, so I apologize that everything is a year behind. If this presentation happened in a month, I'd have 2019 data, and that would be super interesting, but we're stuck with 2018. So here you can see the light green bar is the amount of virtual supply that's offered into the market, and the light blue bar is the amount of virtual demand offered into the market. And then the darker version, the dark green and the dark blue, is what is actually cleared. So you could see that as a measure of liquidity, the average hourly megawatts being virtually bid into the day-ahead market is quite high, over 4,000 megawatts for the most part at times. But what's actually being cleared is much smaller than that. You're talking about less than 1,000 megawatts in most cases. And then you could see the net virtual, and that's that net position I talked, when supply is greater than demand. You could see we're at net virtual supply in all quarters through 2017 and 2018. You can also see it's, the revenue for this is pretty small, $56 million in 2018. It's a $12 billion energy market, so $56 million is really small. And then if you include the cost allocation after that, their net revenues are only $40 million coming from the CAISO. So again, $40 million out of a $12 billion market, it's not a huge component of the market itself. And so a common thing that has been asked of me is, if it's not that big, talking about $40 million out of $12 billion, that's nothing, that's rounding error, right? Why do you need a product like this? And I give two answers, and I'm sure other people have opinions on this, but my two answers are, first, having a financial product just merely exist frequently will discipline the market. So participants will take action knowing that if they try and bias the day ahead one way, or they try and skew either market one way or the other, that virtual will come in. So one of the best ways to ensure, I guess, the right incentive sometimes is to have the existence of products like this. The second reason is that it does allow small participants to mitigate their risk. And we want small participants in the market. We don't just want, huge entities that, can finance their own risk. You want people to be able to engage in the market and set up hedges. So to me, even though, again, it's a small part of the market, it's an important part of the market. Okay, next slide, please. So this slide is very particular to the CAISO, and what it shows is the total monthly renewable schedules and their forecasts compared to actuals. And they're kind of grouped together, and it's a little bit hard to see, but if you just kind of split it out, you'll see that in the, are we there? Yeah, slide 11, yeah. So you'll see on the left-hand side, you have a megawatt, right? And then what this is showing you is they're showing the dark blue bar is the ISM schedule of renewables, of variable energy resources. And then the light blue bar is the ISM schedule plus net, it says VB, but that's a virtual supply. So the ISM schedule plus virtual supply is the total amount bid into the ISM market, okay? and then that's the light blue bar. And then the green is the CAISO forecast of those same resources. And then the red is the 5-minute schedule of these VERS. And then the light, the very lightest green, is now the meter generation from these VERS. And you can see from month to month who is better, the ISM schedule plus virtual supply or the forecast. And you could see whether it's better compared to what RTD is seeing in scheduling, and you could see whether it's better compared to meter generation. And you'll see that historically, some months, particularly if you look at, let's say, April and May in 2019, the CAISO forecast was way off compared to the market. In other times, let's see, like the most recent month, well, no, the forecast was still off compared to the market. But you could find instances, too, where the forecast is better than the ISM schedule plus net virtual supply. But I'll tell you, on average, if you look at these overall, the market has actually beat the forecast. And practically, that's what entities have been trying to do with virtual supply, is really just replace this wind that they know will show up in the real time that isn't in the ISM. And so it's one of those measures of efficiency where it's interesting to me on whether you want a market to determine your price or you want your forecast to determine the price. This is one of those charts that I go back to. And if I saw every single time that the forecast was creating ISM schedule plus net virtual supply, I would be confused on why virtual supply was still transacting and what was going on in the market. But to me, this is one of those measures that says these financial tools are actually helping the market because you are getting a much closer outcome to reality by allowing bids and financial products to schedule in the day-ahead market rather than just dispatching based on forecast alone. Okay, last slide, please. Slide 12. So in a nutshell, virtuals are the key difference between a physical day-ahead market and a financial day-ahead market. They're not the only difference, but they're a key difference. CAISO wind in the day-ahead market is a big driver of net virtual supply. Net virtual supply really does improve liquidity at specific nodes rather than the entire market. It is an imperfect market tool, which I'm sure other people will talk about. There's cross-product manipulation. If virtuals get it wrong, it is just a guess in your own financial interest. You could guess wrong with the wrong information. So that could introduce inefficiency. You could end up making the markets further apart rather than converging the prices. And then when you're talking about the extended day-ahead market, there are many people, I think, who are unsure about the construct of a financial day-ahead market. And so I guess everyone has to decide what the extended day-ahead market is. Is it a financial market or is it a physical market? And then in both those types of markets, what is the role of virtual? I think that could be a PhD dissertation topic. But I think that at least what I think about when we start going into the extended day-ahead market design. Okay, Pam, that's all I have.
Thank you, Carrie. I'm sure there will be plenty of questions to follow up on your presentation. But for now, we will turn it over to Paulo Soto from the Federal Energy Regulatory Commission to walk us through a bit of the FERC perspective on virtual bidding.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, I can hear you, Paulo.
Perfect. So good morning, everybody. Good afternoon for us that are in the East Coast. I thank the organizers and the presenters for putting together such a great discussion. Great, interesting, relevant topics. With Carrie's presentation, I already met my minimum quota of learning for today, so everything that's coming up, it's gravy. So that's great. So I'm Paulo Soto. The title of my presentation is Convergence Bidding, Benefit, Disadvantage, Issues, FERC Perspective. And basically this is my perspective after having reviewed a large number of FERC orders that gave me sort of an overview of what FERC has been thinking about virtual bidding over time. Next slide, please. So this is the scary part, disclaimers. I'm going to read them. The views expressed are my own and do not necessarily represent those of the commission, the chairman, or any individual commissioner. That's one of them. The other disclaimer is FERC's ex parte rules prohibit staff from discussing matters pending before the commission. And I say that this is scary because it's always a reminder that I'm a couple of unscripted remarks away from going back to the private sector. So getting the third part out of the way, let me give you a little bit of background on my perspective. So I'm an economist, and I'm a manager at the Market-Based Rates Program in the West Division of the Office of Energy Market Regulation. Previously, I worked at the FERC's Policy Office in one of the tariff and rates groups in the West Division. As an economist, I understand the complexities of how things affect each other, and usually we'd like to see nicely compact and well-defined issues and draw a conclusion. It does that, but many times those nicely defined issues have ramifications everywhere. So today we're talking about convergence bidding, nicely compact issue, and actually with a cool name. However, as Gary mentioned before, and this is words that you're going to hear a lot in my presentation too, it's complicated. Markets are terribly complicated to begin with. First, we got the physics behind it, terribly hard to capture in a model. And diverting for those physics leads to possible inefficiencies, possible reliability issues, which can be addressed, but by addressing the issues, you create complexity everywhere or elsewhere rather than on the model. There's always complexity that needs to be addressed in electricity markets. Something that is very close to my heart because it's an interesting issue to me and that is present everywhere in electricity markets, in particular in virtual bidding, is information issues. So the only time where we're certain about what happened in the market is usually after the market is run, and even then we don't have all the information to see what happened. So there's tons of unobservables. When we're looking at serving load in the real time, we start with occurring capacity and we end up with the real time, and in between we have the day ahead market. So there is uncertainty in getting to the real time. So information that is not even there when we're making the decisions. And on top of that, there's asymmetric information. So there's information that only some people have. And that's key in any discussion of virtual bidding or convergence bidding, because if there's uncertainty, people may have different views of uncertainty that virtual bidding can help bring to the market if there is asymmetric information. Like, for example, somebody can create a better forecast of what's going to happen tomorrow. They might be able to bring it into the market as a virtual bid. Next slide, please. So giving you all of that background in the discussion, the complexity of the issue, I'll give you my bottom line here. And again, my opinion is that the Commission looks at things under the lens of just and reasonable and not unduly discriminatory standards, and considers things of great complexity through these lens. And the result of that is that we end up in compromises. And I'm not talking about compromises in a bad way, but compromises in the best sense of the word. striking the right balance, making decisions that consider theory, consider practical issues, consider our limitations, even in terms of software to solve the market. So as a roadmap for my discussion, I'm going to discuss the development of virtual bidding, and this is basically through MRTU, how a few facts about virtual bidding in other markets, and at the end I'll talk about, after everything was up and running, what the issues, solutions, and tweaks that have come into the market. And through all that, again, I would say that I think that the Commission has done a great job balancing the cost and benefits of convergent bidding and trying to find the best way to implement it. And it asks for more detail when needed, asks for reports to see how things are going and whether they require modification, and help with changes when changes were required. Next slide, please. So a little bit of history on virtual bidding and convergent bidding. And if we have to start anywhere, my pick was to start in December 19, 2001, with Kaiser the Commission directed Kaiser to propose a plan to implement a day-ahead market. From then on, there were lots of back and forth about virtual bidding, and on June 17, 2004, the Commission required Kaiser to file within 180 days tariff addressing the implementation of convergence bidding. We see the next date there is 2009. So there's an interesting gap that happened there, and there were a lot of back and forth between Kaiser commenters and the Commission that reflects the complexities of market design and convergence bidding. In November 2009, Kaiser filed a conceptual filing regarding convergence bidding. In 2010, Kaiser filed convergence bidding proposal. So it went from conceptual to the actual proposal. In October of 2010, the Commission conditionally accepted Kaiser's convergence bidding proposal by, as Karen mentioned before, by February 2011, convergence bidding was up and running. One thing that I would like to mention here is some of the language that the Commission used to define convergence bidding. So convergence bidding defined as a market feature that involves the submission of bids to buy or sell energy in the day-ahead market that ultimately will not be consumed or produced in real time, which results in convergence of day-ahead and real-time prices. So these are financial transactions that the Commission recognized as not being physical. And the Commission had a reasoning to ask for this to be in the market when they were being delayed. And some of the reasons were that it can improve market performance in several ways, and one of them is to expand the number of competitors and the number of bids in the day-ahead market, which is something essential for competition. And again, I mentioned before, to add more information into the market, again, maybe better forecast, maybe better ways to use the information that is already in the market. And that's pushing the market to the day-ahead market prices to converge in comparison to the real-time prices. So the Commission has also said that convergence bidding reduces incentives for buyers or sellers to forego bidding in physical schedules in the day-ahead market, in the expectations of better markets and the better prices in the real-time market. That it would even facilitate the capital's management of grid operations by allowing it to distinguish between physical bits and virtual bits, or bits submitted for official purposes. So next slide, please. So that gets us to sort of a history of how the commission, the timeline of how the commission got to virtual bidding, and sort of what the commission thought virtual bidding was and what it expected of it. And getting there were a whole bunch of notable issues that were considered. For example, I'm just going to mention a few. For example, underscheduling. So again, there was an expectation some market participants would not bid in the day ahead in participation for better prices in the real time. Convergence bidding can help in two ways here. One, by improving price signals, and the other one, again, by including additional information and additional competition into the market. There was also concerns about virtual bidding and what it could do to the markets. So in the beginning, there was a proposal to, at the start of convergence bidding, to add additional safety nets to prevent unintended market outcomes. And those limits came in the form of position limits at node that slowly went away over time. I think it was a year. The Commission considered convergence bidding at the interties, and as Gary mentioned before, there were issues with that, and there's no convergence bidding at the interties now. Market power mitigation, not only convergence bidding adds more competition in the day-ahead market, which diminishes the potential opportunities to exercise market power. Part of it directly also adds other complications that can increase the possibility of the exercise of market power. But there was also the consideration of what would it do to existing mitigation procedures and whether it will be rendered less effective, and there was no evidence of that at that point. There were also practical considerations. So with virtual bidding, we could come in different ways. Could it mess up the software in a way that it couldn't find a solution? So there were steps taken. One was bid aggregation. So thinking about the potential increase of the number of bids might be too much for the software. One way to help with that is bid aggregation. And that's a balance that back then it was more important than it is now, but it's still, again, it's a very complex mathematical problem to solve to run one of these markets. So on one side, adding more bids makes it a little bit easier to solve conceptually, but also adding more bids makes the number of things that need to be solved a lot higher, so you need more computer power to do that. So again, a balance. And also, the Commission thought it would be a good idea to enforce megawatt constraints in the integrated forward market when no AC solution was otherwise attainable. So if no solution was found, maybe enforce limits to virtual bidding to bring it closer to a solution, bring the market closer to a solution. There were other practical issues, for example, settlement of convergence bidding. So when you're using a market, there's some cost to running the market, there's some cost to transmission, there's a cost of metering, there's several costs, and the CAISO, the stakeholders, the commission has to think about how to allocate those costs, how to allocate uplift costs, a whole bunch of other effects of virtual bidding that run through the system. Again, markets are complex. You're adding an extra element, and that extra element affects everything else in the market. So, for example, CRRs. Did it cause a problem with CRRs? What should the market design do to make sure that those problems didn't extend to CRRs? Tools, for example, what happens if something terrible happens because of virtual bidding and affects the system reliability of the grid operation. So also have the power of suspension from the beginning. And again, the list goes on and on, in which the commission has to balance market design issues with protesters and commenters in support, and again, virtual bidding, and try to find a balance between something that would work for the specifics of the CAISO market. So next slide, please. So this is going to be a short discussion. Virtual bidding in other organized markets. So similar issues. Credit limits, balancing concerns about volume of trading when running the market, again, computational constraints, limits on the amount, minimum limits on the amount that virtual bid could be, so the market didn't get flooded with thousands of really small bids that were just looking for some gain. Again, interactions with FDRs have been issues, how to allocate uplift, something that we'll discuss a little bit more in the next slide, which is mitigation issues. Virtual bidding actually causing divergence between the ahead and real time rather than the expected convergence. One thing, though, again, to the credit of the commission is that, and to the credit of the filers, is that some markets started before CAISO did with virtual bidding, and that provided precedent for some of the CAISO decisions, and also provided with data for a better understanding of how things could work and should work in the market. And next slide, please. So, issues, solutions, and other tweaks. Divergence versus convergence. So soon after virtual bidding got started at CAISO, November 2011, convergence bidding at the enterprise was stopped, and the reason for that was that there were systematic market design issues. So again, one of the things that virtual bidding does very well, or could do very well, is to take information that might not be available to all participants, or information that is available to all participants, and use it the best way they can in the market. So if there's any systematic issues in the market, convergence bidding could take advantage of those issues to again achieve the goal of the convergence bidder, which is usually to make a profit. So systematic issues, market design issues are a problem because they don't go away. They're systematic. They're always there, and they can cause money to be just siphoned out of the system without any solution to it, at least until the market design issue is resolved. In this case, actually decided and the commission agreed to stop virtual bidding. In 2015, actually, the provisions for virtual bidding at the interties were taken away from CAISO's tariff. And since then, there hasn't been any more convergence bidding at interties. Market power issues. So we've talked about a bit on the side of the benefits of convergence bidding in terms of market power, brings more competition into the market. However, in complex markets that have a lot of associated products in them, there's always opportunity to do things in one market that would affect the other market, and that's the exercise of market power, and this beyond anything that could be manipulation. But there are rules against that. The Commission has its rules and has gone against the market issues that allow or facilitate the exercise of market power, and it has gone after the perpetrators of market manipulation in several cases. Effects of long-term contingencies on convergence bidding. This is another example in which there's been an issue and there was a solution. For example, the Aliso Canyon problem, in which CAISO seek temporary tools and some permanent tools to deal with the issues, and the Commission examined them in multiple proceedings and with the information provided by the filers and commenters, reached to a conclusion. And my last slide, please. So I threw at you a whole bunch of information, very high level, but a lot of it. If you have any questions, feel free to contact me, and I'm going to throw my colleagues in Folsom under the bus. So Bob and Saeed, workers in Folsom, great resources to answer any questions. I can answer questions if you have any, or you can address pretty much anybody on the OMR's West Division. Well, thanks. Looking forward to Jeff's presentation and any questions at the end.
Thank you, Polo. That certainly was quite a bit of information that you threw at us there. And I will turn it over to Jeff to wrap us up from the low-serving entity perspective. I think we are probably going to run through our time here, and I hope that we can squeeze in enough time for questions at the end.
Okay, Pam, can you all hear me okay?
Yes. Thank you, Jeff.
Excellent.
Go for it.
First, I'd like to thank everyone that's presented already. I think Terry and Polo's presentations were just excellent. It's brought back a lot of memories. A lot of those intervener comments that Polo was mentioning had my hand all over them. So it has been an immensely complex process to get to where we are. You're really taking yourself out of utility operations and injecting yourselves into the inner workings of the math of the optimization when you start talking about convergence bidding. So for many, it may just not even seem like it has anything to do with the power system. And, well, once you start putting the power system in a computer model, everything has everything to do with running the power system. So it is a complex topic, and I'll try to represent my views. So for clarity, although I am the Director of FERC Rates and Market Integration at Southern California Edison, I am speaking on my own thinking. I'm not representing necessarily all the views of SCE. A lot of them are parallel, but these are my own comments. So hold me accountable, or maybe I'll be leaving the private sector too. So maybe we could go to the second slide. So SCE is a large utility. Our load's roughly 23,000 megawatts in our system. More and more of that's going to different service providers. We still provide the bulk of it. I want to say at the offset that in SCE, we make no profits, no earnings for shareholders through energy trading, including the virtual bidding. So everything we approached this from was from a consumer, almost a consumer advocate's perspective. We wanted what was going to provide the best value for our customers. And Carrie mentioned market efficiency. I agree with much of what she had to say. We are very interested in seeing an efficient market. We believe that does provide long-term benefits to our customers. We are not interested in getting the lowest price possible. Not if that comes at distorting efficiency. That has longer-term consequences that are negative. So we really are after an efficient market. So one of the pros, there's pros and cons from sort of our perspective, or from my perspective working with the utility, for our customers. And the pros, we've talked about this, it does add more supply into the market, even though it's virtual, it's fictional, it's not physical supply. But from a pricing perspective and from an optimization solution space, it provides additional ability to come up with better solutions. And this does have the ability to mitigate potential market power, and it's a very positive dimension of it. It also has the ability to mitigate unforeseen events, such as a major participant not being able to get their bids into the market on time, and instead of there being a gap in the bidding space, you can fill that in with the virtual players. I'd say that's the biggest pro of virtual bidding by far. It does allow some hedging tools, like I believe Carrie was talking about. Basically, it lets you pick your price on whether you want to sell on the day ahead of the real-time market and still get committed in the day-ahead market. So it's nice. There's some hedging, but that's okay. It's nice. In theory, it should converge prices, but it really doesn't. But in theory, it should converge prices, and that's why we call it convergence bidding over our objections of calling it virtual bidding. But in theory, since it converges prices, it removes incentives for people that have a choice of participating in the day-ahead or the real-time market. It removes the incentives to lean on or avoid one of those markets. And the prices are going to be the same. You may as well work in the day-ahead. We just got some more time to get your act together. So in theory, it's a good thing. Practice, I'm not really seeing it, at least broad brush. And finally, from our perspective, and Polo touched on it a little bit, it is a FERC-approved tool, and it eliminates the need for implicit virtual bidding, which is where you say you're going to do something, but you don't do it, or you're going to do something, you don't say you're going to do it. And some characterize that as market manipulation. We never did, but others did. And so it just sort of eliminates that. It makes it, it reduces the amount of finger pointing that goes on with having the tool. Okay, if we go to the next slide. So that's on the pro side. Con side, and this has become a personal, I don't know how to describe this, mission of mine. What is a market? And I'll define a market as two or more, but typically two willing counterparties agreeing on a transaction and sharing the benefits and burdens of that transaction. The key being two willing counterparties. Unfortunately, we find in the ISO space that there's a middleman always between the counterparties, and that's the ISO. And unfortunately, virtual bidding provides a tool for, instead of two willing counterparties to reach an agreement, instead it allows virtual bidders to bet against the ISO rather than a willing counterparty. And when the ISO loses, load generally picks up the tab. So load becomes an unwilling counterparty in almost a unilateral transaction. And I think that's a fundamental issue in core market designs, and not just the ISO, but throughout the nation. that hasn't been addressed and really needs to be addressed. And related to that, when this betting happens, it turns up in the form of uplift. And there can be uplift that I'd say is because of the betting against the ISO or just because of the sequencing of markets. And the RUC is a classic example. If virtual supply displaces physical supply in the day-ahead market, the ISO has to provide additional RUC because call it anything you want, at the end of the day, unless there's physical supply, the lights go out. So, and I think there still is, and like Carrie was saying, a PhD debate on just how physical, just how financial our markets are. But at the end of the day, they're physical, and I don't think there's any debate. And so the virtuals impacting the physical market such that there's costs that are created, you have to get that uplift allocated properly, or again, it falls into category 1, where load becomes an unwilling counterparty to a bet against the ISO. And we did talk about this briefly. This financial tool provides a potential, and I'm not saying, again, there are pros. I don't want to undermine the pros, but it does provide for market manipulation. I believe, and Paul might be able to comment, there's been several cases where people have been found guilty in other markets. I'm not sure they have in ours, but for actually using virtual bids to manipulate and affect congestion to profit on another financial instrument they held, the CERRs or FTRs or whatever variation of letters are used in the market where there's manipulation. So you have to think through how this can happen and try to put rules in place. And it's complicated. Our markets continue to get more and more complicated, and the imagination of people with an incentive to profit is unlimited. So it's very tricky to get the anti-manipulation rules in there. And this has also been talked about to the extent there is a systemic difference in the way the ISO is running the market. It not only extracts dollars that load is forced to pay, but it doesn't bring convergence and it doesn't bring market efficiency. So, and I'll tell you, the market has a bunch of systemic issues. They're always there. And in my opinion, the rules have not been properly designed. It goes back to case 1, to create uplift that forces a non-willing counterparty to fund financial transactions. And I will say that there's been significant dollars extracted from the ISO's market. People have been talking about the suspension of the intertie bids. Back in 2011, I have in my notes here that the DMM, Department of Market Monitoring, estimated that by extracting, exploiting the systemic difference there, that $57 million in 2011 left the pockets of load and into virtual players' hands. They went on for longer than that, but that's numbers in DMM's reports. Okay, so again, pros and cons. There's definitely pros and cons. If the market was simple, I think there'd be a lot less cons. But given the complexity of our market, you know, there's a lot of considerations in that. Okay, we go to the next slide. This is a slice of, Carrie touched on it, this is a different way of representing a different dimension of some of the data. Who's actually using virtual bids? And this is a pie chart I had a member of my team put together. He looked at Feb 11 through the end of 2019. It's estimated that $250 million, $247 million, has been profited by virtual bidders. And again, you know, carried through a $12 billion, I think, number out there, but $10 billion. On the grand scheme of things, it's not a tremendous amount of money, but it's still $250 million. It's still real money. It's very significant money, just relative to the size of our market. You know, it is what it is, but it's still $250 million. The total dollars were more than that, but there were uplifts and cost allocations. And the pie chart here kind of shows you who's using this. And I'll start with what's near and dear to my heart, the, I don't know what you call that color, mustardish looking physical load. And only 4% of the revenues have been used by physical load, or $11 million. We go to the counterclockwise to the gray. The next slice, physical generation. 5%. Again, not much. Then we move to the next slice, sort of the orange. And this is, I think Harry was talking about that a lot of marketers might be using this as a way of making transactions on behalf of others or being able to sell products because they have a tool. 21%. Okay, you're starting to see a larger slice, 61 million. But the large majority is just shy of 3/4. It's just happening from pure financial players that are just placing bets throughout the market and winning regularly and winning consistently. And I'd say that there is a measure of efficiency that the fact that someone is consistently winning says we've got something that's inefficient. If this had been efficient, profits would go to zero. So the very fact that we have this much is showing that our market has inefficiencies still in it. Big ones. Okay, next slide, please. Now, this is something I'll talk to my sort of utility brethren out there. This is a pure financial transaction, and depending on how you're regulated and your regulator's taste for this type of issue, this is different than your normal, I'm dispatching my generator and maintaining my transmission. We, at California, had a lot of regulatory approval to even be able to get permission to use these type of bids. You may not be able to do it. And this was a big concern to us at the time. There's potentially a huge asymmetry where you had all of the non-regulated entities basically being unlimited in their access only relative to whatever their shareholders or private holders would allow them to do for credit risk. Potentially where you had all of the load being forbidden from participating. And that's kind of like, having a boxing match where one boxer's hands are tied behind his back. That really concerned us that this asymmetry was going to be really inefficient. So we and the other utilities, but I'll just speak for Edison, did seek approval from our PUC, basically for defense, basically to be able to undo if someone was doing something that was harming our customers. And we did get permission, but there were a lot of strings attached. I've lost the slide. Pam, I don't know if you could bring it back up, and I'll try to wrap up in just a minute or two. So here's just a little bit of details. We have a PRG, which was a peer review group. We had to sort of walk through what our strategies and what our effects were with sort of stop losses and reporting. And the PUC did grant us permission to use this. I don't want to really go into the details of what we have and haven't done. I think it's confidential. But I will say that that slice of load was 4%, and we're less than half of the load in the ISO. So you'll get a feel of the depth and the extent that it's been used. Okay, I think I've got one more slide. So this is just an issue. I won't go through this all, but there are a tremendous amount of things that cause prices to be different between the day ahead and real time, a tremendous amount of things. I tried to italicize some, and the italicized ones were stuff that were actually completely out of the control of market participants, that these were really being driven by the ISO itself. And again, my philosophy is to the extent a divergence was driven by the ISO, load should not be accountable for any uplifts, and in effect, the virtual bidder shouldn't be paid. So just know that this is only a partial list. Given the complexity of our market, there is almost an innumerable amount of things that can cause divergence, and many of them are, as I say, outside of market participants' control. Okay, last slide, I think. Go to the next, Pam. So just a note here, pros and cons. We talked about sort of betting against the ISO, my concerns there. And we have talked about it even in DMM's report, that when we start having these structural differences, in bold here, you have a purely parasitic drain on the system, adding costs paid by load. Again, though, there are benefits. There are market power mitigation benefits, liquidity benefits, potential hedging benefits. The problem is the complexity of the market makes it really difficult to prevent multi-million-dollar parasitic losses. And I think, again, the key and the real solution is that such parasitic losses should not be funded through uplift, and when that happens, the virtual bidders just shouldn't be paid. I think it's too hard to plug all the holes, but rather having a philosophy of we're not going to pay you if it's not a bet against a willing counterparty is really the only way to address those issues, and that's not being done. Okay, and I think that's it. I think the rest of my presentation just has some references if you want to read more.
Thank you, Jeff, and to all of our speakers. I think this has been very educational, and I will quickly get to questions. I think we're going to take about the next 10 minutes to go through questions. So if you want to press #2 to get in the queue, go ahead and do that. I think we'll have plenty of questions. I'm going to start with one. Carrie, you talked a lot about how virtual supply is being used to hedge wind. Can you hypothesize on the potential role of virtual bidding in an expanded EDAM that includes some regions with a higher penetration of wind generation and where we see a growing amount of wind generation?
Yeah, sure. So can you hear me, Sam?
Yeah.
Okay, great. So it's hard to hypothesize because most wind does bid into the day ahead in real time. It's just there's a certain amount of wind that doesn't want to take, and this is somewhat of a conjecture, but I believe it probably doesn't want to take the forecast risk because they have difficulty forecasting their production in the day ahead market. So they choose to only bid into the real-time market to limit that discrepancy or imbalance energy potential. So if you expanded to the rest of the West, it would depend on how the individual renewables chose to bid into the market. It could be that you end up in a scenario where people don't want to take high risk between the day ahead and real-time differences, but this wouldn't be limited to wind. This could be hydro as well. But it's hard to say because it all depends on individual bidding strategies.
Thank you. And for the questions, would the presenters please turn their cameras on if they're comfortable doing so? And operator, can we go to the phone to see if there's any questions?
Hi, Terry and Jeff. I'm presenting this to you. This is Tony Braun, RIF liaison. Madam Chair, I would turn the camera on, but it doesn't seem to be prompting me with the camera. A current question right now that we're all talking about is DAME and EDAM, the role of virtuals, and the interrelationship between the virtuals and the reliability commitment. I was wondering if you could both touch upon this pricing. Some have advocated for a pricing difference between firm physical products and virtuals. How do we harmonize the existence of the virtuals in the day-ahead process and minimize the aftermarket, out-of-market actions through the other sequential commitments so we come up with an efficient result? I'd appreciate Carrie and Jeff's thoughts on that.
Jeff, do you want to go first?
Tony, yeah, thank you, Carrie. I don't have a crisp answer. I will say that there are some real structural differences where, like, the ISO's commitment process isn't just looking at energy bids. It's looking at the cost of commitment in addition to the cost of taking energy, whereas virtual bids are just, in effect, zero commitment costs. So all things considered equal, the ISO's optimization is always going to take a virtual bid rather than committing a physical resource. That's a real problem. That's going to force a commitment out of the main market and into some sort of residual. That structure needs to be addressed, and it's not yet. And this gets back into, depending on what structures we're using in the sequencing of that, if there are additional commitment costs that are showing up in a different sequential market, those commitment costs need to be reflected back into the virtual transactions to put the virtual and the physical commitment on more of an even footing, or you will not get price convergence, period. So it's complex, and it's even more complex in the EIM because participation in the day-ahead, as I understand it, or the DAME, is still going to be unit-specific voluntary. So we've got a new wrinkle that not only do you have all the issues we have in the current market, but you've got market participants that have the option of being in that market or physically committing outside of the market. I haven't even been able to get my mind around how all that's going to impact.
So obviously I have a little bit of a different view, if you guys have heard me talk during the DAME. So my thought is, what is the virtual supply? What is its functional role specific to the CAISO right now? Is it replacing a unit that's expected to show up in real time with commitment costs or not? So right now, virtual supply to me is making up for the wind, and wind has no commitment costs. And then you come along with RUC. And now if RUC is committing long start resources, then you do end up with some inefficiencies between having a sequential ISM and RUC, because you do end up facing commitment first on a market and pricing based on that with the virtuals, and then you end up having to pay for a long start resource to start up that may or may not be needed in real time. However, practically looking at the data, I don't think the CAISO is actually committing a lot of long start resources. I think they're picking mostly RA resources that are forced to offer into RUC for $0, and because they're short start resources, they only get paid in real time if they're actually needed. So the efficiency of virtuals really depends on what ends up showing up in real time and what ends up getting committed in RUC. Under today's paradigm, where you have this bilateral RA market that enables kind of this free must offer in real time. I say free because it's paid in this external market, right? It's paid in RA. So to me, I look at RUC right now and it seems pretty efficient because you're not actually starting up many long start resources at all. And generally in California, we're getting rid of these longer start resources and we're moving towards storage and fast start resources. And these are costless for the most part in RUC. So virtuals aren't adding a lot of cost. However, if we now extend this concept to EDAM, we now have a completely different resource mix and we have a different RA paradigm. And that's why I've pushed personally over and over again to move this discussion, not in DAME on the role of virtuals, but to EDAM, because while it's efficient with the current CAISO resource mix, I don't know that it's efficient with a different RA paradigm that doesn't have that real-time must-offer, and that RUC must-offer at $0. And I don't know if it's efficient if the wider West has a lot of long start resources, end up getting committed in RUC. Maybe you end up getting a lot of cleared virtual supply and you have to commit long start on top of that. And like Jeff said, I agree that's inefficient. So while it's efficient today with virtuals, because again, it's making up for wind. It's actually converging the market and I think doing a good job. I don't know that that's true with EDAM, and that would take more data.
Great. Thank you both for your answers. And Polo, I have one more question for you. You had quite the issues list of notable issues, and I was wondering if you could maybe recommend a good entry point for someone on this call who's looking to learn more about the Commission's perspective on convergence fitting. Is there any docket or a particular order that you think would be a good entry point to help someone explore this topic more?
Yes. So I would say the MRTU orders, both the conceptual and the actual proposal, are good starting points to see. So again, that's where I got the list of issues from the two orders. And there's a lengthy discussion on all of the issues listed there on, again, the proposal, the commenters, and what their issues were with the proposal and what the commission came up with. So that will give people a good view of the thinking of the commission on that.
Excellent. Thank you. And thank you all for your excellent presentations. I'm going to quickly turn now to our carbon panel. I believe Therese Hampton will go first, and then followed by Mary Winke with Pacificor.
Thanks, everyone.
Great. Thanks, Pam. Can you hear me?
Yes, go ahead.
Great. Okay, terrific. Thanks so much for inviting us here, and thanks for doing this kind of virtual approach to these meetings. It's helpful during this time. I know that Mary and I we have you over the lunch hour. The great part about doing this virtually is if you want to go get your lunch, and we can be kind of your lunchtime speaker. What I'm going to do is just go over an update on what's happening in the regulatory process with Washington's Clean Energy Transformation Act. Just a reminder for some folks, and if you go to the next slide while I'm giving this context, back in 2019, Washington passed its 100% carbon-free bill, and it has kind of two primary features. By 2030, utilities in the state have to have, basically the way the bill reads is it says it wants you to be 100% carbon-free. From 2030 to 2045, there is an option for alternative compliance. And alternative compliance says that you can use electricity that is not carbon-free, but you have to mitigate it, either with the purchase of an unbundled REC or a different market energy transformation projects that are defined in the bill, or different types of options that you have to offset that emitting generation. But by 2045, the goal is to serve load in the state with zero emitting generation. So that's kind of the overview of the bill in its very highest form. This is a slide that's taken from the Washington Department of Commerce. There are a lot more details around the bill, a lot of other features in the bill that were very important to those that kind of worked on the legislation. So I'm not trying to kind of do a comprehensive summary of the bill, but just focus in on this piece, because what I want to talk about is some of the issues that have been identified and that are currently under conversation in exactly how you look at using clean electricity, non-emitting electricity to meet load in the state of Washington. So if we go to the next slide, we are in the rulemaking process. And just a reminder for everyone in the rulemaking process is, well, let me tell you first what the legislation requires, and then I'll talk a little bit about the two different regulatory agencies. The legislation says that rules are needed for implementation of the legislation by January 1 of 2021. So just really, not too far away. The rulemaking processes started last fall. They started with different workshops and informal conversations, and the regulatory agencies are starting to share draft rules for conversation and having workshops to talk about those. So those have started. But the legislation also very specifically created a markets work group, and I put the kind of language from the legislation in there to examine the efficient and consistent integration of the Act and transactions with carbon and electricity markets outside the state. At the time that the legislation was being written, there were two things happening that made this language important. The first was Oregon was going through its legislative process to pass a cap-and-trade bill. That, we know, didn't pass, and Oregon is not pursuing that type of policy, but at the time this was written, there was a thought that there would be two states with a carbon pricing structure. But the second thing was that the utilities that were interacting on this legislation could see elements of the law that were very concerning relative to both centralized market purchases, but also just general market purchases, anything that might be considered a system purchase or an unspecified purchase. And so we asked that we have this opportunity to have a markets work group to have a more thorough and detailed conversation about the impacts associated with that. And the rules, there's a section there that says rules are required by June 30 of 2022, so a whole year and a half after the initial rules, defining the requirements for load met with market purchases and Western Energy Imbalance Market or other centralized markets administered by a market operator. And what I'm going to set up for you is there's a little bit of a challenge right now to have really the majority of the rules kind of set by January 1 of 2021 when the market element is a year and a half later. So if we go to the next slide, it kind of outlines where we're at in the process, and this is where I was going to say, just a reminder, consumer-owned utilities in the state of Washington are regulated by the Department of Commerce to the extent there are regulations set. They are not regulated. They are regulated by their governing bodies, but the rules that they follow are set by the Department of Commerce. And the Washington Utilities and Transportation Commission have regulatory authority over the investor-owned utilities. And as we've been going through these processes, the Commission and Commerce try to be as aligned as possible on issues where it's important that they be aligned. There are some elements where consumer-owned utilities and IOUs can do them differently. But the Department of Commerce issued a discussion draft on specifically how to comply with this 80% and the 20% alternative compliance in April. And the part that was important there was they required that electricity and non-power attributes of electricity be acquired in a single transaction. And if the underlying power was sold, it must be sold as unspecified. It's been very important throughout the process that attributes not be double counted. And in particular, a concern that if you're using compliance for the law in the state of Washington, that not be used for compliance in some other state. Formal comments were submitted on June 15th, and utilities broadly supported those draft rules. But some stakeholders commented that the compliance for this 80% portion would require retirement of a bundled rec and a deliverability demonstration. And the reason why I put that bundled rec in quotations is because there isn't a definition of bundled rec in the law, so there's a lot of interpretation of what that means. And a deliverability demonstration, I'll just say from a public generating pool perspective, we don't believe the law has a deliverability demonstration. So this is where the kind of issue has kind of been born, is in this concept of how people are looking at what a bundled rec means and whether there's a delivery requirement. The UTC staff released an interpretation in June that that delivery of a bundled rec is required, and those comments are due today. So this is just a little bit of landscape, right? There's two different regulatory agencies on an important issue, and we've got two different interpretations and comments going forward. The reason why we think this is important, if you go to the next slide, the reason why we think this is important to this group and kind of the connection to the energy imbalance market is how they define compliance will really impact the way that Washington utilities and the resources that they rely on can interact with the rest of the system. The really significant concern is if you have a very specific delivery requirement, an intention to match resources to load, you are really going to limit the ability for utilities and their generation to participate in the efficiencies in the market. What we know, what we've seen from studies is that the more that you can allow resources to be used to meet the loads in the hours and moments that they need to be met, that we all benefit and get greater efficiencies from that, and we can see reduced greenhouse gases from that as well. So the concern with some of these rulemaking impacts is depending on how compliance is defined, you could reduce the efficiency of the bulk electric system. If you really set it up so that Washington utilities are really kind of trying to keep their resources fully for themselves, you miss opportunities to kind of share and offset load and resource, and that can result in overbuild and additional oversupply of the carbon-free resources that people are investing in. Second, it could limit participation in centralized markets. So I'll go to this, I'll expand on this a little bit more on the next slide, but some of the requirements that can't be demonstrated by a centralized market will just limit that possibility. And sorry, I wasn't quite done with that slide, but that's okay. The third is that what we found is that if you limit participation in efficient markets and in centralized markets, you could impede the ability to achieve emissions benefits. And we've seen that in recent studies that the more you provide for efficient markets, the more you get carbon benefits. So specifically, the issue of participation in markets and the reason why we're having this conversation here is some of the requirements that are being considered can't be demonstrated in centralized market purchases. So centralized market purchases are considered system purchases or unspecified. They just, because of the nature of it, you can't match a specific resource to a specific load. So by definition, they have to be considered system or unspecified. And so if there's a requirement to have it be something different than that, by definition, it will limit the amount of centralized market purchases that a Washington utility can have. Centralized markets do not track or convey RECs. So if there's some definition of what bundled means, that means any power that's delivered out of the EIM or the EDAM has to be paired with a REC. That just can't happen. And then centralized markets just do not match resources to load, so we can't kind of make that requirement. So the way the PGP utilities, and I would say other utilities in the state of Washington see this, is that unless there's an approach that allows this concept of if you purchase the electricity and the attributes together, but then whatever happens to the underlying electricity, as long as it's not sold in a specified transaction, unless we have a definition like that, purchases will need to be mitigated with an alternative compliant option, and that's limited to 20% of load. But by definition in the law, that's limited to 20% of the load, and frankly, there's a desire for that to reduce over time to get to zero by 2045. So we think this is important because some of these requirements could restrict Washington Utilities' quantity of centralized market transactions, which ultimately says you've got limited participation in EIM, and you've got limited participation in EDAM, which could undermine the benefit calculation, and it could eliminate or significantly impact any potential RTO considerations. So the next steps, if we go to the next slide, the next steps for those of us engaged in the Washington process, the comments to the commission are due today. Some stakeholders have recommended joint workshops between the Commission and Commerce. Some stakeholders have recommended decisions on this issue be deferred until the Markets Work Group has completed its work because there really is such a strong connection between the compliance rules and the ability for utilities to participate in markets. But absent a deferral, rules are due on January 1st of 2021. So this is an important issue to Washington utilities. We're working closely with each other and with all the stakeholders on this issue, and hoping that it's resolved in a way that we can continue to support and engage in the markets that are ongoing and under discussion. And with that, I'll transition it to Mary.
All right, can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you.
Okay, great, thank you. Hello, my name is Mary Winkie. I work for Pacificor, but I'm going to be talking today from the perspective of the EIM entities, giving an update, I think an update from the discussion at the June RIF from last year. If many of you remember that, there was an all-day forum on the interaction between greenhouse gas policies and energy market interaction. And it's been a year, and there's been a lot of discussions that have happened in various forums since then. So providing an update primarily on some of the thinking and activity of the EIM entities. And just, I think, a very broad way of kind of setting this up, I think it's a good dovetails well with what Therese was just talking about. And we're sort of thinking about if, we look and see what Washington is doing and what happens if, 8 states across the West adopt similar policies and you really have kind of a potential for a real balkanized
policies being implemented, and we see a strong need for regional coordination to work through some of those issues and avoid some of these impacts to centralized markets that Therese was mentioning. So we can go ahead to the first slide. Second slide, I guess. So just as a preamble, you know, the EIMSPs are a diverse group of utilities and all have unique situations, in particular when it comes to environmental policies, depending on what state they are in and the policies and politics of their particular state. So this summary is not the viewpoint of any individual EIM entity, but does represent some general principles that those entities have coalesced around. So just want to be clear about the perspective that I'm providing today. So we can keep going. Great. So this is an overview, I think primarily of kind of what we talked about last year, but just as a little bit of a background. And Therese talked a little bit about this as well. But, you know, environmental policies interact with each other as well as the potential for expansion of organized energy markets. And as Therese talked about, there's a need and a desire among states who are adopting these policies to have ways to enforce them and also to identify specific resources that are delivered to load in order to understand what is the nature of the energy that's being imported into those states. And organized markets do not easily accommodate that tracking or that accounting on a very specific basis. And then also a significant challenge if multiple states adopt different greenhouse gas pricing policies where you're faced with a situation of dispatching a broad regional, geographically diverse footprint while also incorporating components of different environmental policies across states. So what we really see is I think, a multifaceted approach to addressing these issues. I think there's a strong need and desire for coordination among states to not adopt the same policies, but to consider how the policies interact and to consider some level of coordination to ensure that there are not seams or barriers constructed to efficient markets. And also that the market design is compatible and reflects those environmental policies, and that the market design does not inhibit or prevent the states from meeting its objectives reflected in those state policies. And then also just thinking through appropriate accounting methodologies. Now, I think Therese mentioned, you know, strong prohibitions in most states against double counting of renewable attributes. And if you have conflicting accounting methodologies, you can create opportunities for that double counting potentially inadvertently. Okay, we can keep going. Next slide. So this just, and folks are probably pretty aware of the level of policies that's been passed. There's a number of states that have adopted renewable and clean procurement programs, and then a number of states, in addition to California, who have been thinking about and proposing cap and trade or carbon pricing type programs. So I think what the conversation, I think, is really around, you know, both figuring out how can markets and policies be harmonized based on what is currently in place today, but also we want to have something that is scalable. If an additional state adopts a carbon pricing program or a policy that it doesn't completely, you know, that whatever market design and put in place doesn't have to be redone to accommodate that evolving policy. Okay, keep going to the next slide, please.
Okay, so I'm going to talk a little bit about the different types of policy programs that implicate markets, and they implicate markets in different ways, and I think it's really important to be clear about the types of policies that are impacting the markets and how they're doing that. And then there are also interactions between policies, but I think it's at first just really important to understand that the different programs are different and have different implications for markets. So the first type of program is carbon pricing. Generally carbon pricing is done at the smokestack, but we've seen California impose a price in addition to the smokestack in the state to imports from other states. And the proposals that we've seen from both Oregon and Washington also included putting that price on the import. So that creates challenges because essentially you want resources dispatched to serve load in those states in a different manner than resources dispatched to serve load in other states. So you can potentially create seams between states just by virtue of the desire or the need to dispatch that market in one optimization and based on one footprint. So we also see, if states, say, adopted different prices, so that California had one price, Oregon had another price, Washington had another price, as you have multiple states with multiple prices, the complexity compounds. So there may be a need to have some elements of policy streamlined, like, for instance, one carbon price across the region. Okay, we can go to the next slide. So the second type of policy is a clean or renewable procurement program. Very different from a carbon pricing program. These types of programs, most folks are familiar with, are PSs that set annual procurement requirements or compliance period procurement requirements. And typically the way that the compliance with these policies is demonstrated is through the retirement of RECs, and Teresa already went into that in some depth, so I won't dwell on it here. But one of the things is that if Washington is moving in the direction of a delivery to load requirement, you do have potential challenges where Washington may be determining what's delivered to load to its state in one way, and if other states adopt conflicting or different accounting methodologies, you have the potential for energy being identified as being delivered to different states at the same time. So I think that, one of the things that we've been thinking about is what does some type of West-wide accounting methodology look like, and what are the tools that we can use to ensure that the accounting methodologies are robust and that also conflicts and double counting or undercounting is avoided. Okay, we can go on to the next slide. Okay, so I just want to briefly, take it up just a couple of steps before we conclude here. That I think it's really important that we all work toward both meeting the environmental policy objectives and efficient wholesale electricity markets, because at the end of the day, in particular, PacifiCorp's view is that efficient wholesale electricity markets will be a key component in achieving decarbonization and achieving those reductions in greenhouse gases and increased renewable resources that most of the policies that are being adopted promote. So, I think it's really important to recognize that, we're all moving in the same direction. The question just is really exactly how that's going to happen. And then also just want to mention as well the criticality, I think, of respecting individual state autonomy. I think that the message today isn't everybody needs to adopt the same approach, or, the West needs to become a monolith or adopt the same policies, but that there should be some consideration across states on what elements of consistency can be adopted to avoid some of the potential interruption or creation of schemes and interrupt the movement to a more efficient, organized market. Okay, can you keep going to the next slide? Okay, just again, I think underscoring what I've already really talked about in terms of the need to really recognize the relationship between policy and market. And that is going to be a really critical conversation over the next few years. And I think important to emphasize a critical conversation among market participants and the CAISO and others who are engaged in the EDAM process, and that as well as state policymakers. And I think there is some conversations that are beginning and greater recognition that the market design needs to consider state policy, and state policy also needs to consider market design. So we can keep going to the next slide. Okay, so these are 5 principles that the EIM entities developed, really trying to direct and provide a framework for potential solutions. You know, I don't think the message here today is not that there are solutions or those have been designed. I think so the issues are very complex, and there's likely not a silver bullet. So I think these principles are really put together with the idea of framing potential solutions. And some of this I've already talked about, but that the market design should reflect and be consistent with state policy objectives, that there shouldn't be, the market design shouldn't mute or interfere with those state policy objectives. And then, again, respecting state autonomy and recognizing that jurisdictions that have not adopted a greenhouse gas or renewable procurement policy should not be improperly affected from policies based on other jurisdictions. So the first 2 principles really kind of go together, in a sense, just saying that to the extent a state has not adopted a policy, that policy should not be imposed upon that state by virtue of the market design. And then the third one here, just that there should be, that the market should reflect the market design and should impose a greenhouse gas price or renewable benefit where appropriate. I think a key component of ensuring that, the costs and benefits are being appropriately assigned in the market that do reflect those state policies. And then, the method for assigning and verifying compliance obligations should be consistent with or reconciled to how the market design allocates costs and benefits. So I think there's a recognition from my perspective that the market design cannot perfectly accommodate the detailed components of state policies across a broad footprint. And so there could be a market solution that achieves an outcome that is not perfect, but there may be in-market design solutions and then out-of-market reconciliation following the market design that can fully implement those state policies. And then, again, I think just a strong sense of not creating market designs that unfairly disadvantage similarly situated resources, both renewable and non-emitting, inside jurisdictions with greenhouse gas programs as compared to those outside of jurisdictions with greenhouse gas programs. I think that's obviously a very important element to, I think, complying with federal law as well as maintaining market efficiency. Okay, I think we have one more slide here, maybe 2. Can try to leave some time for questions, Pam. Oh, good, only one more. Okay, so just conclusion here, I think that we really want to have the ability to move forward with EDAM and other organized market elements. As we all know, EIM has been very effective already in enabling higher deployment of renewable energy, and that it's important to consider that, and market design must be compatible with policy objectives of individual states. And then just kind of some key components here, I think, in terms of thinking about some of these issues and how you go about creating consistency and harmonizing accounting methodologies. I think, again, conversations among states as far as what they need to demonstrate compliance with their policies, data transparency, again, harmonized accounting methodologies to avoid the double counting and potential undercounting of attributes, and then also some type of uniform tracking system. I will mention here that we do have, in the West, we have Regis to account for RECs, and I think it's maybe going one layer deep and one layer deeper and looking at what are we achieving with Regis. Are there places where greater uniformity can be adopted, either within that system or separate to that system, to help ensure some of these accounting methodologies are harmonized. So that's a lot. I just want to give a I think the takeaway here is that that some of these issues are very complex, and I think if these conversations are happening in various places to think through both market design and policy, we can set ourselves up in a really positive way if we are thinking about this in advance rather than trying to fix something that's already in place. So I will leave it there and turn it back over to you, Pam, for I don't know if we're going to have time for questions or not. I will turn it back over to you.
Thank you, Mary. We do have time for questions. We're scheduled through 12:30 today. So, operator, would you go through the instructions for asking questions again, and we'll check the queue.
All right, as we move into Q&A, please feel free to place yourselves in the question queue by dialing #2 on your telephone keypad. You'll hear a notification when your line is unmuted, at which point please state your name, the organization you represent, and your question. Again, that's to enter the question queue.
While we wait for folks to queue up, thank you, Therese and Mary, for that presentation. I think having these two topics together just represents a lot of the intricacy and challenges of the interrelationship between different market design elements, and thinking about the role of virtual supply is part of a tool to hedge renewables at the same time as we think about greenhouse gas accounting. I know that there's some question in there, and it just starts making my head spin around the complexities that we have to work through as we're contemplating market design and changes to the EIM and the expansion to the day-ahead market. And I think, just thinking through some of these different perspectives is very helpful. So thank you to all of our presenters for bringing two very interesting and complex topics to us today. Do we have any questions in queue?
Yes, we do. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Rebecca Wagner from Wagner Strategies. I'm a consultant in Nevada and working on regional issues. Hi, Mary. Hi, Therese. I think the question is for Mary, but always love having Therese's input. I look at how complex and challenging what you're trying to accomplish when we think about some kind of coordinated effort on the West and how we arrive at some methodology or even a framework for addressing carbon and how it's priced and how it's counted. In your perfect world, what would be the venue, or how would this be accomplished? If you could wave your magic wand Would you pull PUC commissioners together from all states? Would there be a regional framework? What would be the perfect thing for you in order to facilitate and achieve this?
Wow, if I had a magic wand, that's actually a difficult question to answer, Rebecca. I think that it is a conversation probably among, the governor's offices and policy advisors' offices. There are some of those conversations that are happening, as many folks are aware. But I think that, to me, is specific to the policy questions, which in my mind are some of the things that Teresa was talking about in terms of how are you measuring compliance, how are you counting renewable energy or clean energy towards your state objectives. That it's actually not a straightforward question in terms of how things are counted. And then also what types of policies might be in place that can be problematic if different states adopt different approaches. So I think that conversation needs to happen at that policy level. I think the conversation about carbon pricing and carbon accounting in an organized market is going to happen in the CAISO framework as part of the EDM stakeholder process. They do have greenhouse gas is on, I think, the bundle 2 portion of their stakeholder process, at least as it is currently envisioned. So I would expect that to really be about market design, and then have kind of a policy question or policy conversation kind of separate from that. I think, in an ideal world, we'd all sort of be rowing the same boat in the same direction, which I think we are. But inevitably, you also have particular ways in which states have, considered their policies and considered how they will evaluate compliance that can be challenging when talking about how that's expanded across a multi-state footprint.
Teresa, do you want to add anything on that question? You're on mute, Teresa.
I don't. I think Mary answered it very well.
Do we have other questions in the queue?
Yes, we do. We'll go to the next caller in queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hi, this is Cheryl Murray. I'm with I'm the liaison for the Consumer Advocate Group, and I have it's probably more specific than we want to get to, and maybe premature also, but when Teresa was talking about, depending on how Washington sets up their rules, there's a potential that they won't be able to participate in the day-ahead market or some other, potentially other markets in CAISO. And I'm wondering, from the perspective of PacifiCorp, which the utility operates in 6 states with various policies, if Washington were not able to participate in the day-ahead market, would that create any physical differences in how PacifiCorp might operate, or would it simply be financially not giving the benefits to Washington and attributing them to the other states? I hope that makes sense.
I think your question does make sense, and I know the question's for Mary, but let me just clarify one thing, just so that maybe I hope that it's not unclear. Depending on how Washington determines the requirements, it would just limit participation. There's nothing that we see that would prohibit somebody from participating in centralized markets, but it could really limit the amount of participation that they can engage in.
Okay, thank you.
But I think you still have a question, I think, maybe for Mary about if there was a limitation, how might they handle that?
Right. Yeah. I do not have a perfectly clear answer to that question. You know, PacifiCorp operates on a 6-state basis, and we see a lot of benefit for all of our customers in all of our states from being able to harness that geographic diversity. And, you know, to the extent that one state takes a particular view of the operational aspect of that, I think it could be problematic. So I don't have a perfect answer. I mean, we in many respects are still working through the CETA implementation, as is everybody else. But we do see it as a significant concern in terms of the potential limitation of accessing some of those geographic benefits on our system as well as in the broader regional market. Thank you both.
Other questions in the queue?
Yep, we'll go to the next caller in the question queue. Caller, your line is unmuted.
Hello, this is Vijay Satyal with WRA. Thanks, Therese and Mary. Good presentations. I had a question on Mary's comment on the market solutions could give an outcome that may not be perfect, so it may be prudent to look at out-of-market solutions. So it makes intuitively a lot of sense to me, but I was wondering if there has been some discussion in the Washington region as to what kind of areas you think could be considered for out-of-market solution. And I say that because you appropriately recognize that carbon counting, the counting rules on calculating carbon, greenhouse gas, the other requirements on pricing could all fall in the Cal-ISO ballgame of EDAM. So are there things that you can think of, or could you elaborate on what would be valuable for us to think as out-of-market factors that could simplify or hopefully make life a little easier in market design? Thanks.
So I'll make two comments in response to that. Good question, Vijay. The first one, with respect to Washington and respect to RPS and clean procurement standards, I actually think that a good model to look at and really to understand more clearly is how they've implemented RPS and renewable accounting on the East Coast and in other regions with organized markets. They have robust tracking systems that are used. They do not assign resources to load, but rather they take a very, what I'll call an attribute-based approach. And I think there's a lot to be said to looking to that, and that would be basically an out-of-market approach, where you're really looking at what are the attributes of energy, and you're not necessarily getting into complexities of what actually happened in real time, or what happened in real time beyond how much energy was produced over a particular time frame. But I'll say on the greenhouse gas accounting side, you may have a market solution that is dispatching the entire footprint with some greenhouse gas pricing elements in it, but not every resource may be perfectly priced based on its individual emissions profile. And we see that today, and the way that that's been addressed is through use of an unspecified or default emission factor. So you may have the application of a default emission factor, and then after the market runner, after the market has dispatched, you may have a reconciliation between that default factor and what you ultimately actually know about the resources that were dispatched and on whose behalf. So I think that's, again, I don't have a actual proposal. That's kind of how we've been thinking about it in terms of that after the fact reconciliation. Because the reality is, for a system like Pacificor, it's relatively easy to identify the emissions associated with our system. The challenge is figuring out sort of where it was delivered and who it, kind of belongs to. So it's trying to leverage the things that you can do easily versus the things that are more complex.
Thank you. That helps a lot. Thank you.
Therese, do you have anything to add on that question?
No, I think Mary did a great job.
Any other questions in the queue?
I'm not showing any other questions at this time.
Well, I think that then concludes today's Regional Issues Forum. I wish we could give a round of applause to all our speakers. I think there's been a lot of excellent presentations today. So I will give you a round of applause, and hopefully everybody is clapping along virtually at home. We will reconvene and identify the timing of our next Regional Issues Forum, which will be announced shortly. So thank you, everyone, and have a great afternoon.
That concludes our conference. Thank you for using AT&T Event Conferencing Enhanced. You may now disconnect.